After my husband passed away, his parents insisted on staying with us to help with the kids. At first, I thought they were grieving too, until they told me what they planned to do with my house. My name is Jessica, and this happened in Atlanta. Before everything fell apart, my life was simple. My husband, Michael Davis, and I had been married for 9 years. We both worked normal jobs and tried to give our kids a stable life. We had 2 kids. Our son David, 8 years old. Quiet, thoughtful, always building something with Legos. Our daughter Elizabeth, 5. Loud, curious, constantly asking questions. 5 years ago we bought our house. 3 bedrooms. Small backyard. Slightly outdated kitchen. But it was ours. I still remember the first night after we moved in. Boxes everywhere, pizza on the floor because we didn't have a table yet. Michael looked around the empty living room and said, "Kids are going to grow up here." At the time, his parents helped with part of the down payment. His father, William Davis, had always been practical. Retired HVAC technician. Believed in hard work and family responsibility. His mother, Linda Davis, worked part-time at their church office. When we bought the house, they contributed about 20% of the down payment. Linda hugged me the day we signed the papers and said, "We just want to help you 2 start your life." I thanked them more times than I can remember. At the time, it felt generous. That detail becomes important later. 10 months ago, everything changed. Michael left for work on a Tuesday morning. Same routine as always. Coffee. Quick kiss goodbye. Complaining about Atlanta traffic. By the afternoon, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. When I answered, a man introduced himself as Officer Richard Anderson with the Atlanta Police Department. Even now, I remember the exact tone of his voice. Careful. Controlled. He asked if I was Jessica Davis. I said yes. There was a pause. Then he told me my husband had been involved in a serious car accident. For a moment, my brain refused to process the words. I kept waiting for him to say Michael was okay. He didn't. Michael died before the ambulance reached the hospital. Just like that. One phone call. 9 years of marriage erased in a sentence. The next few weeks barely exist in my memory. Funeral planning. Paperwork. People showing up with casseroles. Trying to explain to an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old why their dad wasn't coming home. David stopped talking much. Elizabeth kept asking when Daddy would wake up. Michael's parents were around constantly. William and Linda Davis looked devastated. Linda cried almost every time she saw the kids. At first, I appreciated having them around. Grief makes everything heavy. Cooking dinner felt impossible. Getting the kids to school felt impossible. Just getting out of bed felt impossible. About 3 weeks after the funeral, William sat down across from me at the kitchen table. He cleared his throat and said, "Jessica, you shouldn't be doing this alone." I didn't know what he meant. Then Linda spoke. "We were thinking, maybe we should stay here for a while. Help with the kids." At the time, it sounded like kindness. I was exhausted. Overwhelmed. I said yes almost immediately. They moved in the following weekend. At first, it actually helped. Linda cooked dinner most nights. William fixed things around the house that had been broken for months. David started talking again. Elizabeth liked having more people around. For a few weeks, it felt like we were all just trying to survive the same loss. Then small things started changing. Linda began making comments about the house. Nothing obvious at first. Just small remarks. One evening, she was standing in the living room looking around. She said quietly, "This house holds a lot of memories for us too." I assumed she meant Michael. I nodded and didn't think much about it. A few days later, William said something similar. He was sitting on the back porch watching the kids play in the yard. He said, "Michael worked hard for this place." I agreed. Of course he did. But the way William said it felt strange. Like there was more behind the sentence. I didn't realize yet that those comments were leading somewhere. It wasn't until about a month after they moved in that everything finally became clear. And when it did, I realized my in-laws hadn't just moved in to help. They had moved in because they believed this house belonged to them. By the time my in-laws had been living with us for about a month, the house didn't feel like my home anymore. At first, the changes were small. Linda started rearranging things in the kitchen. Nothing dramatic, just moving dishes, replacing where we kept things. I told myself she was just trying to help. Then she started making decisions without asking. One afternoon, I came home from work and she had completely reorganized the pantry. Another day, she told David he couldn't leave his toys in the living room because it made the house look messy. Technically, she wasn't wrong. But the way she said it felt different. Like she wasn't a guest. Like she was in charge. William slowly started doing the same thing. He began handling things around the house without talking to me first. One evening, I came home and saw a new lock installed on the backyard gate. William was standing outside with a toolbox. I asked, "What's that for?" He said casually, "Security. Someone has to think about these things." I remember thinking it was strange he didn't ask first. But again, I told myself they were grieving too. I kept making excuses. Then the comments about the house started becoming more direct. One evening after dinner, Linda stood in the living room looking around the walls. She said quietly, almost to herself, "Michael loved this house." I said, "Yeah, he really did." She nodded slowly. Then she said something that made my stomach tighten. "He wouldn't want it to fall apart." The way she said it made it sound like she thought that was already happening. A few days later, William brought up finances for the first time. We were sitting at the kitchen table while the kids were doing homework in the next room. William leaned back in his chair and said, "Houses are expensive to maintain." I said, "I know." He looked around the kitchen slowly. "Mortgage, repairs, taxes, it adds up." At the time I assumed he was worried about how I would manage everything alone. So I told him I had already spoken with the bank about adjusting the payment schedule. But he didn't respond. Instead, he just nodded like he was thinking about something else entirely. Looking back now, I think he had already made up his mind about something. A week later, things started getting tense. Linda became more critical. She started pointing out things she thought I was doing wrong. One night, she told me I should consider switching David to a different school because she didn't like the neighborhood. Another night, she told me the house was too big for one person to maintain. That comment stuck with me. Too big. At the time, I didn't argue. I was still trying to keep peace. Grief makes you tired in ways that are hard to explain. Every conversation feels like climbing a hill. But the moment that finally made me uneasy happened late one night. The kids were asleep. I was sitting in the living room trying to finish paperwork for insurance claims. William walked in and sat across from me. He watched me shuffle papers for a few seconds before speaking. "Jessica," he said, "have you thought about the long-term plan?" I looked up. "What do you mean?" He nodded toward the house. "For the property." The way he said it made something in my chest tighten. I said carefully, "The plan is for the kids and me to keep living here." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he rubbed his chin like he was thinking through a complicated problem. Then he said, "That might not be realistic." The sentence hit me like cold water. I asked, "Why wouldn't it be?" He leaned forward slightly. "Because this house wasn't just Michael's." I frowned. "Of course it was Michael's. And mine." He shook his head slowly. "No. Your mother and I helped make this house possible." That's when I understood where the conversation was going. I said carefully, "You mean the down payment?" He nodded. "We invested in this home." The word invested made something in my stomach drop. At the time they gave us that money, they called it a gift. Linda had literally said those words. But now William was calling it an investment. I tried to stay calm. "You helped us, yes. And we appreciated it." He shook his head again. "You're misunderstanding." At that moment, Linda walked into the room. I suddenly had the strange feeling this conversation had been planned. She sat beside William and folded her hands. William continued, "That house has value now. A lot more than when you bought it." I stared at him. "And?" He looked me directly in the eyes. "We need to start discussing what happens to it." For a moment, I honestly thought I misunderstood. I said, "What do you mean?" Linda spoke this time. "Selling it might be the smartest option." My brain struggled to catch up. "You want me to sell my house?" William answered calmly. "It's not just your house." The room suddenly felt very quiet. I said slowly, "This is where my kids live." Linda nodded like she understood. "Exactly. Which is why we need to make responsible decisions." My chest felt tight. I asked, "What exactly are you suggesting?" William said it plainly. "We sell the house. Divide the value fairly." The words didn't make sense at first. Divide the value. Fairly. I looked at them both, waiting for someone to say they were joking. No one did. Instead, William added, "You could downsize. Find something smaller for you and the kids." I stared at him. "You want me to sell my home and move my kids out?" He shrugged slightly. "That might be the best solution." Linda nodded in agreement. "The house is too much responsibility for you alone anyway." For a moment, I couldn't even speak. My husband had been dead barely a month, and his parents were sitting across from me discussing how to sell my house. I finally managed to say, "This house belongs to my family." William's expression hardened. "It belonged to Michael." Then he said the sentence I will never forget. "And Michael isn't here anymore." The room went silent. Something inside me shifted at that moment. Until then I had been patient, understanding, trying to respect their grief. But hearing him say it like that, it felt like a line had been crossed. I stood up from the table. "I think this conversation is over." William didn't move. Instead, he said calmly, "We should continue it soon." Linda added softly, "This is something the whole family needs to face." I didn't answer. I just walked upstairs to check on the kids. David was asleep. Elizabeth was curled up holding one of Michael's old t-shirts. I stood there watching them breathe and felt something settle in my chest. That house wasn't just a building. It was the last place my kids still felt their father. And there was no way I was letting anyone take that away. What I didn't realize yet was that my in-laws weren't just talking. They were already planning their next move. And that's when I finally decided to start looking at the paperwork for the house. Because something about that conversation didn't feel right. And I needed to know exactly where I stood. What I found in those documents changed everything. The morning after that conversation, I couldn't stop thinking about what William had said. We invested in the house. The word kept repeating in my head. When Michael and I bought the house 5 years earlier, his parents had helped with part of the down payment. About 20%. At the time, they told us it was a gift. Linda hugged me in the driveway the day we got the keys and said, "We just want to help you two get started." Nothing about it sounded like a business deal. But the way William talked the night before made it sound like they believed they owned part of the house. So that morning, after the kids left for school, I started pulling out paperwork. Our filing cabinet sat in the hallway closet. It was one of those cheap metal ones Michael bought from an office supply store years ago. Inside were folders labeled things like insurance, taxes, mortgage. Michael had always been the organized one. I opened the mortgage folder and started going through everything. The original loan documents were there. The closing paperwork from when we first bought the house. Bank statements. Property tax records. At first, nothing looked unusual. Then I remembered something. About a year before Michael died, we refinanced the house. Interest rates had dropped and the bank offered a lower payment if we updated the mortgage. At the time, Michael handled most of the paperwork. I signed what needed signing and didn't think much about it. So I started searching for those documents. It took about 10 minutes before I found the folder labeled Refinance, Southern Trust Bank. I sat down at the kitchen table and began reading through the papers. Halfway through the stack, I noticed something that made me pause. The ownership line listed both our names, Michael Davis and Jessica Davis. At first, that didn't seem unusual. But the next line caught my attention. It said, joint tenancy with right of survivorship. I didn't immediately understand what that meant. So I pulled out my phone and searched the phrase. When the explanation appeared on the screen, I read it 3 times. Then a 4th. It meant that if one owner died, the other automatically became the full owner of the property. No court. No inheritance process. No shared claims. The surviving owner kept everything. Which meant when Michael died, the house legally became mine. Entirely. I sat there staring at the paperwork for several minutes. Part of me felt relieved. But another part of me felt angry. Because the conversation with my in-laws suddenly looked very different. They hadn't been confused. They had been pushing. Later that afternoon, William brought the subject up again. He was standing in the backyard while David and Elizabeth played near the fence. When I stepped outside, he said casually, "I've been thinking more about what we discussed." I crossed my arms. "About selling the house?" He nodded. "Your mother and I spoke to someone." That sentence immediately made my stomach tighten. Spoke to who? A lawyer. I stared at him. "You talked to a lawyer about my house?" William didn't seem bothered by the question. "We wanted to understand our options." "Our options. Not yours. Not mine. Our." Linda walked out onto the porch just then and joined the conversation. She spoke gently, like she was trying to calm a situation that only existed in her mind. "Jessica, we're just trying to protect what Michael worked for," I said quietly. "This house protects my kids." William sighed like I was missing the point. "That's exactly why we should handle it responsibly." I looked directly at him. "You mean sell it?" He didn't deny it. "The market is strong right now." The calm way he said that made my chest feel tight again. I realized something in that moment. They weren't speaking emotionally. They were speaking strategically. Linda added softly, "You could move somewhere smaller. Something easier to manage." I asked, "And what happens to the money from the sale?" William answered immediately, "We split it fairly." There it was again. That word. Fair. But the more I thought about it, the less fair it sounded. My husband had been gone barely 2 months. And his parents were already calculating property value. I didn't argue with them. Not yet. Instead, I said something simple. "I'll look into the legal side of things." William nodded like that was the answer he expected. That night after the kids went to bed, I scheduled a meeting with a real estate attorney. 2 days later, I sat in an office in downtown Atlanta across from Robert Miller. He was a middle-aged man with gray hair and glasses that kept sliding down his nose while he read the paperwork. He flipped through the refinance documents slowly. After a few minutes, he looked up at me. "Where did you get these?" "From our refinance last year." He nodded. Then he pointed to the ownership section. "Did anyone explain this clause to you?" "No." He tapped the paper. "This is joint tenancy with right of survivorship." I looked that up. "Then you already know what it means." I nodded slowly. "But I want to be sure." He leaned back in his chair. "When your husband passed away, his ownership automatically transferred to you. So legally, you are the sole owner of the property." I felt a strange mix of relief and anger. "What about his parents?" "They have no claim. But they helped with the down payment." He shrugged. "Unless there's a written agreement stating it was a loan or investment, it's considered a gift." There wasn't any agreement. Not a single document. Robert Miller closed the folder. Legally speaking, the house is entirely yours. On the drive home, I kept thinking about that sentence. The house is entirely yours. When I pulled into the driveway, William's truck was parked out front. Linda was watering plants near the porch. For the first time since Michael died, I felt something different from grief. Clarity. Because now I knew exactly what was about to happen. And for the first time since that awful conversation at the kitchen table, I was ready for it. After meeting with the lawyer, I didn't confront my in-laws right away. I wanted to think. Driving home through Atlanta traffic, I kept replaying everything that had happened over the past few weeks. The comments about the house. The way William kept talking about investment. The conversation about selling. It suddenly felt very calculated. When I pulled into the driveway, William's truck was already there. Linda was on the porch watering the small plants near the railing. She looked up when I got out of the car. "How did work go?" she asked. "Fine," I said. She smiled politely, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. Inside the house, William was sitting at the kitchen table reading something on his phone. He looked up when I walked in. "We should talk tonight," he said. The timing almost made me laugh. "Actually," I said, setting my bag on the counter, I was thinking the same thing. Dinner that night was quiet. David talked about a science project at school. Elizabeth spilled her juice and started crying. Normal kid stuff. But underneath it all I could feel the tension sitting at the table with us. After the kids went upstairs to get ready for bed, William stood up from his chair. "Let's sit down," he said. We gathered at the same kitchen table where that first conversation had happened. William folded his hands in front of him. Linda sat beside him. I sat across from them. William spoke first. "Your mother and I spoke with someone about the house." I nodded slowly. "I figured." He looked slightly surprised. "We wanted to understand the situation clearly." Linda added gently. "We're trying to make the best decisions for everyone." I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder from the lawyer. I did the same thing. William leaned forward slightly. "You talked to someone?" "Yes." He seemed almost pleased. "Good. Then we can settle this properly." For a moment none of us spoke. Then I opened the folder and slid the documents across the table toward him. "You should read this." William picked up the papers. Linda leaned closer so she could see. For several seconds the only sound in the room was the faint rustling of pages. William read the ownership section once. Then again. His eyebrows slowly pulled together. Finally he looked up. "What is this?" "The refinance paperwork from last year." He tapped the page. "What does this clause mean?" "You tell me," I said. He read it again out loud. "Joint tenancy with right of survivorship." Then he looked at me. I answered calmly. "It means when Michael died, the house legally transferred to me." The silence that followed felt heavy. Linda shook her head slowly. "That can't be right." I slid another paper toward them. "That explanation came from the attorney I spoke with today." William stared at the document for a long time. I could almost see the moment it sank in. Finally, he said quietly, "But we helped pay for the house. You gave us money for the down payment. It was an investment." "No," I said calmly. "It was a gift." Linda's voice sharpened. "We never meant it to be permanent." I met her eyes. "That's not what you said 5 years ago." William leaned back in his chair. For the first time since this whole situation started, he looked unsure. "So what you're saying," he said slowly, "is that we have no claim." "That's exactly what I'm saying." Linda let out a frustrated breath. "That's not fair." I didn't raise my voice. But my patience was gone. "What's not fair," I said quietly, "is trying to force a widow and her kids out of their home." William shook his head. "That's not what we were doing." "Then explain what you meant by selling the house." Neither of them answered immediately. Linda finally spoke. "We were trying to protect Michael's legacy." I felt something tighten in my chest when she said that. "Michael's legacy is our kids," I said. "And this is their home." William rubbed his forehead like he was frustrated. "You're thinking emotionally." "Of course I am. This is a financial decision." "No," I said. "It's a family decision." The room went quiet again. Then William said something that completely surprised me. "So you're not willing to compromise?" I stared at him. "You tried to take my house." "We were trying to protect what belongs to the family." I gestured around the room. "This is my family." For a long moment none of us spoke. Then Linda stood up from the table. "If that's how you feel," she said coldly, "we shouldn't stay here anymore." The words sounded like a threat. But honestly, they felt like relief. William stood up slowly. He looked around the kitchen like he was seeing it differently now. Then he said something that made everything finally clear. "You've destroyed this family." I didn't answer. Because at that point I realized something important. Families don't destroy themselves because someone refuses to give up their home. They destroy themselves when people decide money matters more than love. The next week they packed their things. Neither of them said much while they moved out. They didn't hug the kids. They didn't apologize. They just left. A few days later William sent me an email. He said he was disappointed in how I handled things. He said Michael would have wanted the family to stay united. I read the message twice before closing it. Because the truth is, if they had come to me differently, things might have been different. If they had asked for help, if they had spoken honestly, maybe we could have figured something out. But instead, they tried to pressure me. They tried to take the one place my kids still felt close to their father. And that's something I will never regret protecting. Now the house is quiet again. David builds his Lego cities in the living room. Elizabeth still sleeps with one of Michael's old t-shirts. Sometimes I walk through the house at night and remember the first evening we moved in. Boxes everywhere. Pizza on the floor. Michael smiling like he couldn't believe it was real. This house holds those memories. And no one is taking that away from my children. Still, some relatives say I should have offered William and Linda money since they helped with the down payment. Others say they crossed a line they can't come back from. So now I'm wondering what people outside the family think. Was I wrong for refusing to give my in-laws anything and keeping the house after everything that happened?